You mentioned falling and the problems with falling and breaking things and mortality related to that. I wonder whether or not there are also health-related effects of just having weak bones that are not just about falling and breaking a bone and dying a year later, even though that's obviously very severe. Because I think when people hear about that, some people might think, well, I'll just be more careful. I'll just move more slowly. I'll sit in a wheelchair if I need to, even though I might be able to walk if it keeps me from falling. Some people, I think, adopt that mentality. What are some of the benefits of having high bone mineral density for men and women that are perhaps independent of risk of injury?
Well, I think it's actually the inverse of what you just said, right? It's sort of like you have to sort of be able to articulate what it is you want in your marginal decade. So we use this thing in our practice called the marginal decade. Marginal decade is the last decade of your life. So everyone will have a marginal decade. That's the only thing I can tell you with absolute certainty, right?
I believe you.
There's no immortality. There's no hidden elixir that's going to help us live to be, whatever. I mean, we're all going to be in our last decade at some point. And outside of people who die suddenly or through an accident, most of us know when we're in that marginal decade. You might not know the day you enter it, but most people, who are old enough, if you tell them, are you in the last decade of your life? They probably have a sense that they are. So I think the exercise that we like to go through with our patients very early on is have them in exquisite detail, more detail than they've ever considered. So we have to prompt them with like 50 questions, lay out what their marginal decade should look like.
Wow. That's a serious exercise.
It's a very serious exercise, right? Like tell me everything that is going to happen in your marginal decade. I don't know when it's going to be, Andrew. It could be 87 to 97 if we're doing well, right? It might be 79 to 89. I don't know. But it would really be a very nuanced exploration of that topic. And I think until you do that, all of this other stuff is just abstract and kind of nonsense. Until a person can tell you what it is that they want to be doing in that last decade, you can't design a program to get them there. I mean, think about it. Someone wants to do an Ironman. We take it for granted that we know what the objective is. I have to be able to swim 2.5 miles. I have to be able to get out, take my wetsuit off, hop on my bike, ride 112 miles, get off my bike, take the bike shoes off, put the run shoes on, run 26.2 miles. Like, we get it. We know what the objective is. And only by knowing that can you train. Can you imagine if I said to you, Andrew, I'm going to have you do an athletic event in a year. Start training. I'm not going to tell you what it is.
Right.
Just do it.
Right.
It could be playing basketball. It could be swimming to Catalina Island. It could be running 100 miles. You wouldn't be able to do it. So similarly, if we don't know what our marginal decade is meant to be, there's no way to train for it.
Do you think this is a good exercise for anyone and everyone to do on their own, regardless of age? Here I'm hearing this
Absolutely.
And I'm thinking, I need to think about when my last decade might be and what I want that to look like.
Absolutely. I mean, when I say we do it with our patients, that's only because that's the population I work with, but there's simply no reason everybody shouldn't be going through this exercise.
And then you sort of back script from there, figure out what people should be doing given their current health status.
That's exactly right. We call it backcasting. So the first step we do is once we've really delineated what the objective function looks like, we then say, okay, how do you break down that into metrics that we can measure? So, you described doing a whole bunch of things. Okay, just to let you know, to do that will require a VO2 max of 30 milliliters of oxygen per minute per kilogram. And the person will say, okay, what does that mean? We'll say, well, that's a measure of your maximal uptake of oxygen. And that declines at about 8% to 10% per decade. So if you have to be at 30, and let's just assume you're going to be doing that at 90. So what do you need to be at 80, 70, 60, 50? Okay, here's what it would need to be at 50. Okay, what are you now? There's a big gap. You're below where you need to be now. So you're obviously higher than 30 now, but if you're only at 42 now and you need to be at 30 in 40 years, you're not going to cut it. You have to be a lot fitter. Okay, now let's do the same exercise around strength and stability. And without exception, most people, when they do this exercise, will find out they're well below where they need to be. So the gravity of aging is more vicious than people realize. And therefore, the height of your glider needs to be much higher than you think it is when you're our age, if you want to be able to do the things we probably want to be able to do when we're 90.
I absolutely love this approach. I've never done it in terms of my health. I've always thought about what I want to accomplish in the next 3 to 6 months or next year or so.
And by the way, that's a great approach. That's forecasting. Forecasting is fantastic. Forecasting is really good at short-term things. It doesn't work for long-term things. Long-term, you have to do backcasting.
This backcasting approach really appeals to me because in my career, well, I never anticipated I'd be podcasting. But that's what I did at some point as an undergraduate. I looked professors and I'm like, that looks like a pretty good life. They seem pretty happy. I talked to a few of them and then I figured out what I need to do at each stage in order to get to that next rung on the ladder, and just kind of figured it out in a backcasting kind of way, as you refer to it. I think this is incredibly useful because it puts all the questions about blood work and how often to get blood work and what to measure in a really nice context that's highly individualized. I've never heard of this before. So,
and I should give a nod to Annie Duke. I used to always refer to this as reverse engineering. But in Annie Duke's book, she wrote about this exact thing and called it backcasting. And I was like, I like the term backcasting better. I think it's more intuitive than reverse engineering.
Yeah, there's a real genius to it. And I think because it sets so many things into the appropriate bins and trajectories.